have a very, very exciting event for you today. First, to get things started, let me introduce myself. My name is Timothy Connor. I'm co-chair of the Special Events Committee with the American Chamber of Commerce in Japan, and we're sponsoring today's event. I'd like to welcome all of you today, both members and guests. The ACCJ is a very, very dynamic, member-driven organization. And one of the things that we pride ourselves on is feedback from the organization. Today, at the end of the event, members are going to receive in their inbox a survey about today's event. Please feel free to comment in the survey any thoughts you might have. We also have a very special initiative. It's called Idea Box. Idea Box at accj.or.jp. This email address is open to members, guests, and anyone to send in any thoughts, ideas, anything at all you might have that you want to convey to the Chamber. We look forward to any kind of feedback from you. I'm also welcoming quite a number of guests here today. Notables Japan guests, America-Japan Society guests, other guests with members. Should you be interested in joining the Chamber, we have information outside the door as you leave. Please feel free to ask Kondo-san over here, or myself, or anyone else about membership opportunities. Finally, before we go into the event, I have a special request, a moment of silence. A moment of silence on your cell phones. Could you all please check that your phone is on manner mode? I'll do the same. Thank you very much. Okay, let's get into the main event. To get us started here, first I'd like to introduce the moderator of today's talk. Justin Turcat is not only a member of the ACCJ, he's also the founder of Notables Japan. Justin began his career in the music industry as an executive in the music industry, working with many, many well-known artists, and he's continued that in his work with Notables Japan here. Justin, can I ask you to take the stage, please? I'm in control. Our main guest speaker today has had an amazing 40-year career. First, as a top musician with the London Symphony Orchestra, during which time he visited Japan a number of times. Then as managing director for 21 years of the orchestra as well. Now he's the executive and artistic director of Carnegie Hall. Carnegie Hall is the most influential and the most important music institution in the entire world. Sir Clive was knighted in 2005 for his contributions to the music industry, and his insight and his knowledge of music in general is, frankly, breathtaking. Could I ask everyone to please join me in a warm welcome to Sir Clive Gillinson.
At least I only had one chair to choose from.
Thank you, Timothy, and to the ACCJ for hosting us in the American Japan Society. Before we begin, I just wanted to also give a special thanks to Clive, who took time out of his really busy schedule. I think he's been on 3 continents in the last 2 days, full schedule in Japan. And just to elaborate a little bit on Timothy's introduction, I think we're very fortunate to have Clive here, as he's someone who's reached the highest levels, not just on the artistic side, where he was a world-class cellist in the London Symphony, but reached the highest levels in the leadership and management side, initially with the London Symphony Orchestra before taking over Carnegie Hall about 10 years ago. And on top of all that, he has a relationship with Japan that began 40 years ago. So I'm sure we have lots of interesting stories to hear about from him, as well as, I think, lots of insights along the way that we may find relevance on our own professional or personal lives. So having said that, Clive, maybe a good starting point would be the origins of Carnegie. How did it start? How did it get to where it is today?
Well, like so many things in life, it happened almost as chance. And Andrew Carnegie's wife sang in a chorus in New York. There was no concert hall, so as you do, she said to her husband, "Could you please build us a concert hall?" So, being Andrew Carnegie, he said yes. And in fact, he did everything wrong. And yet he built the greatest concert hall in the world. And he went, instead of going to the greatest architect of the day, or somebody who'd even built a concert hall before, he went to the guy who was the treasurer of his wife's choral society, who happened to be an architect. And he said to him he'd like him to design a concert hall for him. And he sent him around Europe to look at all the greatest concert halls in Europe. And he came back and designed a concert hall that bore no relationship to anything he'd seen, and he built the greatest concert hall in the world. Which is, you cannot do something like that by chance. It's a bit like trying to build a Boeing airliner by chance if you've got the pieces. It doesn't happen by chance. He just must have had an extraordinary instinct. But the thing to me that's even more baffling about it is Carnegie Hall is not one hall, it's 3 halls. There's the main hall, the Isaac Stone Auditorium, which is 2,800 seats. There's the medium-sized hall, Zankel Hall, and then there's the small one, the recital hall at 268 seats. Now, having built the 3 halls, the big one and the smallest one there's nothing ever been built that's better than either of them. The middle-sized one was completely useless. So I don't even get that, how you can create the most extraordinary thing twice and something that doesn't work at all once. And so it fell into disuse. It wasn't used as a hall, and it became a cinema, for those of you who knew New York in all those days. And only in 2003 was it restored. They had to dig down into the bedrock to create a bigger space, and it became Zankel Hall, which is now our 3rd hall again, so it's back to the original vision. The other thing that, again, is baffling is when you talk to acousticians today, I mean, everybody thinks building concert halls is pure science. I mean, I think it is a combination of science and art. And if you speak to an acoustician, they'll say, great concert halls shouldn't be much more than 2,000 seats. The big hall is 2,800, so he got that completely wrong. They say you should have straight walls everywhere, front, back, and sides. In Carnegie Hall, the back is curved and the front is curved. Both ends of the hall are curved. So somehow he did it all wrong and did it more right than anybody has ever done before or since. So it's fascinating, and it also is an insight for me into something that's a fundamental for me about the people I want to work with, is not only do you want brilliant people, you want people who've got an instinct for the job.
That's really fascinating. You know, we met a lot of people before the talk started today, and it's such a diverse audience. We have, the public sector from many different countries, and government, and academia, and nonprofit, and private sector, I think from real estate to kabuki. And I think that just shows, it's a reflection of music, I think plays an important role in all of our lives in one way or another. And I think we all here recognize that music has this transformational value to it. And in fact, my understanding is Carnegie Hall's operating premise off that very notion. I think one of the core beliefs I've heard from Carnegie is that the power of great music should be accessible to all. And I'm wondering if you could elaborate on that, especially as it relates to the scope of Carnegie Hall's activities, both inside of New York and around the world.
Sure. Sorry. One of the things I've long felt is that there's a lot of people who are very privileged in one way or another, which is either your parents love music or art in general, or you learn it in school. If you don't, then you possibly will never have the opportunity to experience this through your life. And so one of the fundamental things that drives everything we do is the notion that every single person has the right to have music as part of their life. So we've developed now a massive education program. We in fact reach about 500,000 kids a year through our education programs in America. And those are continuing to grow. Next season is our 125th anniversary season. And one of the biggest things we'll be doing in terms of developing our plans for the future is to yet again grow, hopefully exponentially, the number of kids that we reach. But it's not just kids. I mean, the bulk of what we do is kids, but we also work in prisons and hospitals and hospices and youth at risk centres. And again, music can be utterly transformational to people in those situations. And I mean, let me just give you two very quick examples. And that is, I went to the closing project just recently that we've been doing in Sing Sing, which is a prison where it's people who are there for very major crimes, a lot of them murderers. And in fact, the music work there has utterly transformed it. And in fact, the prison governor feels this is one of the most important things they do. And we work with there's a specially trained musicians who work with a group of prisoners, and the prisoners create their own music around poems that they write, and then they also learn to play instruments as well. So they participate not only in creating some of the music that's going to be performed, but also they are then the performers alongside our musicians. And so at the final performance, which was the culmination of a year's work, there was music that had been composed by a lot of the prisoners. And one of the things that was interesting is how they all feel that their lives are defined by the four walls when they're in prison. Through the music, the whole world is open to them. And it actually enables them to think positively about the fact they have a future as a human being in real life as well. And I spoke to one of the prisoners who'd written some music, and at the end I said, what does this project mean to you? And he looked at me completely baffled, and he said, this isn't a project, this is the most important thing that's happened in my entire life. And so, you know, it's interesting how important it is to think in the broadest possible way about the role that a great institution like Carnegie Hall can play in people's lives in that way, and it does transform lives. It's the same with kids, and I feel very strongly that it's not just about education. So much of education is quite linear. A lot of the education all of us have in schools where there's a single answer, and yet what we're going to need in our lives is the ability to ask questions, to explore, and really to live in a world where there is no single answer, and that everything comes out of asking good questions and really exploring possibilities. And music education in schools, I think, is a fundamental part of developing that part of the brain. So we do feel very strongly that that is a central responsibility for Carnegie Hall. And curiously enough, it's something most people don't know about either, that we do. It doesn't matter how much you publicize it. People just think, greatest concert hall in the world, concerts, and that's it. But we do have a very, very broad responsibility to society as well.
I think, you know, that's one of the reasons why I was always initially attracted to getting involved with Carnegie when I was in New York, was I always felt that I had this recognition that music was so powerful, and I felt Carnegie, wow, this is the institution that was actually operating off that premise. And I think it's really fantastic.
Well, I think just worth saying, it's something that doesn't just inspire the people we work with, it's just as inspirational to the people on our side of the field who are actually doing the education work. And, you know, every single one of them feels they learn every bit as much as the people they're working with. So it's absolutely a two-way street.
So, you know, over your years in the music industry, I'm sure you've gotten to know some amazing musicians and personalities, and was hoping you might be willing to share some of these figures and any stories that stick out in your mind.
Well, yes. I mean, in that way, it's been a very privileged life. I've worked with some of the most extraordinary musicians in the world and learned a huge amount from them. I think the two people who've had the biggest influence on me, and to me are the most extraordinary artists I ever worked with, are Leonard Bernstein and Mstislav Rostropovich. Leonard Bernstein, in fact, we created the Pacific Music Festival on Sapporo with him, in Sapporo with him. And I remember he was already very ill then, but it was typical of Lenny Bernstein. I mean, this was only months before he died that we created it in June, July 1990, and he died that fall, that autumn. And he was there very ill. He'd brought a doctor with him. He brought an acupuncturist. He was in terrible pain. It was hard enough for him even just to stand up. And everybody was saying to him, you've got to go back to America. You've got to go and continue your treatment. And he would not. He refused to let the students down. And so every day I remember him, you know, struggling to get him up, and he would go to the rehearsal. And what was extraordinary was the minute he was sitting there with the music, you didn't know there was anything wrong with him. He gave all the energy was there, and then he would collapse afterwards. And that happened at the concerts as well. To the audience, it was Leonard Bernstein. There was nothing wrong with him. And then afterwards, everything was drained and had gone away. And he gave a press conference at the end, and he was asked, look, you've been one of the world's greatest conductors, composers, you've created West Side Story, you're a great educationalist. If you could only choose one thing, which would it be? And he said, that's easy, education. I learnt with the greatest teachers and the greatest performers in the world. It's my responsibility to share that and pass it on to the next generation. So, I mean, that's been a very inspirational thing for me, and has certainly helped to guide a lot of my life in music. Another thing that he did, which again, I mean, to me is a fundamental principle. People often ask me, what is the most important talent of any great performer? And I always say humility. Because in fact, lots of people have huge talents, but if they don't have humility, that talent doesn't grow from the first day to the last day of their life. And Leonard Bernstein absolutely personified that. And towards the end of his life, he'd conducted the Tchaikovsky symphonies his entire life. Towards the end of his life, he threw all his music away for the Tchaikovsky symphonies because he wanted to learn them again and think about them fresh, just looking at the music written on the page. He didn't want anything about what he'd accumulated in terms of his knowledge, understanding, interpretation. He wanted to start again. And that's the sort of approach to life, and that humility and that questioning and the wishing to learn from day one till you die was something that defined him. Rostropovich was similar. And, I remember once somebody going into his room at the end of a concert, and the question people so often ask a performer is, could you tell me what your favorite piece is? And he said, that's simple. It's the piece I'm playing now, or I shouldn't be playing it, which I think is actually very profound. And if you don't feel that way, that every single thing you do is the most important thing you're doing, don't do it. And with Rostropovich, there was another example which was absolutely typical, which was, I don't know whether any of you know, I mean, the great writer Solzhenitsyn, who at the time of Stalin, he was writing all about the prison camps, the political prisoners, and he lost everything. He lost his home, everything, because of Stalin. And he had nowhere to go, and Rostropovich, at great risk to himself, took Solzhenitsyn into his home. The minute he did that, he lost everything. There were no concerts, his entire career disappeared. And he said he used to walk down the street at that time, very depressed. He'd walk down the street, and he suddenly discovered what friendship meant. Because he said when he walked down the street, most of the people he'd thought were his friends were so scared they would always somehow or other be walking on the other side of the street and not realize he was there. So one of the things he said was friendship was the most important thing in his life. So that's one piece. But the other was, suddenly the phone rang and he was offered a concert. And they said, it's a concert up in Siberia in an aircraft hangar for 4,000 people. So he went up there with his pianist, and they arrived and there was nobody there. And he said, what's happened? And they said, look, we're terribly sorry, but nobody remembered to publicize the concert. So there's nobody here. And he said, do you mean there is nobody here? And they said, well, look, there are 5 people. There's these 5 ex-political prisoners who have walked across the snow of Siberia for the last 4 days. Somehow they'd heard about your concert, and they've walked here to be there for your concert. But obviously you don't do a concert for 5 people. And he said, on the contrary, I do. And he did his whole recital to a standing ovation from the 5 people in this aircraft hangar for 4,000 people. And he played every one of his encores as well. So in other words, he gave everything to every single thing he did. So, I mean, I just find those sort of people, they teach you some of the most important values in life.
That's very incredible stories. You had mentioned about the PMF that you helped create with Leonard Bernstein in Sapporo, and I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the Japan NYC Festival that you did with Seiji Ozawa in New York.
Sure. Well, in fact, I think it was 2011. It was something I'd always wanted to do. We did a big Japan project when I was at the London Symphony Orchestra in London, and Japan has been a big, big part of my life. I've probably been here for 25 times at least, both as a musician and then as a manager. And there are so many things about the values of Japan that mean so much to me. And so it was something I really wanted to do. So we developed this huge project. And one of the things we've done with our festivals in New York is they're not just about music. We talk to the visual arts, theatre, film, dance, literature. We try and build projects which are an exploration across the entire field of culture. And so this is what we did for Japan. And I mean, my dream obviously was that Seiji Ozawa would be the artistic director. I came to see him to see if he'd be willing to do it. And he said, I have never, ever done anything like this in my life. I never put my name to big projects. This is going to be the one time in my life I do this. And he said, I will do this, I want to. And so we planned it with Seiji, and it was a huge project, as I say, across the whole cultural spectrum. We brought many performers over from Japan. Again, not just classical music. I mean, there were all sorts of things. There were groups, little, artistic performing groups throughout in the countryside. I mean, there was a lot of research went into it. And then, I don't know whether any of you know, but I mean, at that time, Seiji had terrible problems. In fact, he had a back problem, and he could hardly conduct. And I remember, I mean, again, absolutely typical of him, the doctor was saying, you cannot conduct, because he was going to open the festival with his concerts. And he said, I have to open the festival. So in the end, we arranged for him to conduct half of each of those concerts, even though he shouldn't have been doing any of it. And the doctor said, you have to conduct just sitting on the rostrum, don't stand up, don't move around, just use your hands. Now, if any of you know Seiji Ozawa, within 2 seconds, he was on his feet, he was using his hands, everything. And I was sitting there in my seat, terrified, because you see this guy giving everything, which he's not allowed to do, and thinking, he's going. I mean, not only is he going to damage himself, but he won't get through the concert either. I mean, it will be a disaster in every way. Somehow he did it. He got through all of the concerts that he was doing. Unbelievable. I mean, it was one of those things where the audience knew what he was doing and what his commitment was. So the ovations were beyond belief. They were phenomenal. And then he really did get sick, and he couldn't do any more. But by that time, the whole festival was flying, and he'd given it the start that he had to do. And I mean, one of the things I think just worth mentioning, because he had an incredibly close relationship, in fact, with Mstislav Rostropovich. They were closer together than either of them, any friends either of them had. And I remember once, and Seiji would drop everything. Anytime Rostropovich asked him to do a concert, it didn't matter what Seiji was doing, he would say yes and he would come. So we were doing a concert with him at one of Rostropovich's big birthday concerts that we did in London. And at the end, Rostropovich made a speech at the reception afterwards about Seiji. And they used to call each other, Rostropovich was Seiji's big brother, and Seiji was Rostropovich's little brother. And so Rostropovich made a speech about his little brother, Seiji. And Seiji was standing there. It was so moving. The tears were just running down his face. And he was meant to make a speech himself afterwards, but he couldn't because he was just crying. And in fact, they did one of the most important projects to both of them in Japan here. And what they did, they decided they were going to bring a small orchestra together. And this, again, I mean, is a typical idea of both of them. It's not the sort of thing anybody who wants to be world famous, who wants to be having publicity, you don't do this. So they got this small orchestra together, and they traveled around Japan in a truck, playing in villages where no concerts ever took place, ever. And so they would go to these villages, and typical Rostropovich, who had a wonderful sense of humor, they apart from the orchestra, they also engaged what Rostropovich called they tried to find the worst trumpet player in the world. And what they would do is they would arrive at each village, they'd ask the trumpet player to play, everybody would come rushing out of their houses because the noise was so terrible. And wondering what on earth it was, and then they would announce the concert they were going to do. So the trumpet player was the carrying call. So they did these concerts, and either they might play in a little village hall or wherever it was, or they just play on the back of the truck for the villagers, and they do an hour's concert, then they'd move on to the next village. And both of them, they did this for about 2 weeks around Japan. And for both of them, they said it was actually the most extraordinary musical experience of either of their lives. And it was part of the reason they were such close friends, doing something like that, which most musicians wouldn't even have considered doing.
Well, I wonder if there's any footage of those performances.
I don't know.
We touched a little bit on Carnegie's education programs earlier, and I think we have a clip we were going to show, but first maybe if you could discuss a little bit about the scale and scope of a few of the programs, such as Link Up or...
Sure. We do programs really across the spectrum, all the way from programs for little kids, right the way through school at every age. The other thing we try very hard to do, and I think you've got a little bit of Link Up.
Yes, that's correct.
And so I'll talk just a little bit about Link Up, which is it's a program for elementary schools, because it also represents many of our values. And it uses an orchestra, a symphony orchestra, so we engage an orchestra in New York to do it. And it's a 3-year rolling program which enables kids to really learn about all the rudiments of music. But every one of the kids participating in the project has to play an instrument. And so they will be learning an instrument, and then when it comes to the final concert each year, they come into the concert hall and they are playing alongside the orchestra. So every single person in that auditorium is playing, including all the kids. So it's a huge experience. But what we've done now is we've created what is a template that we can give away. So we've got all the curriculum, all of the details of the program, everything. We give it away now to 70 orchestras. It's built up every year to 70 orchestras all around America. So what we're doing is by giving it away, we're giving world-class resources to orchestras that would never be able to afford it otherwise. And so, I mean, it's cost us a lot of money to do it, but I mean, one of my mantras is money follows vision. You've got to go for the things you believe in. And interestingly enough, we've just been given a huge donation, which will enable us to do this program for another 10 years, over the next 10 years, and expand it massively so that we reach 5 million kids over the next 10 years through this donation, and we can give it away to many, many more orchestras around the country. In fact, it's also being done at the PMF. We've given it to the PMF as well, so it's being done there, and it's something we're looking to give away. So all the time, we're not just trying to do great programs for the people we connect with in New York. We're trying to think, how do we leverage what we do so that the benefit can flow outwards? So that's how we reach 500,000 kids right now, and we'll obviously continue to reach far more in the future. But we feel Carnegie Hall's responsibility is what I think is the greatest music institution in the world, is to have a role which is about supporting the future of music in the widest sense. And a lot of people would say, I mean, you know, when you're talking in arts institutions, very often people say, how do you monetize this? How do you monetize that? Our view is that's not the point. The point is, how do you support the sort of experiences you can give people's lives through music, which is why we give it away. But the interesting thing is, by having given it away, we have now brought in the money to do this as well. Now, if we'd tried to monetize it, we probably wouldn't have gone to the places that needed it most, because they wouldn't have been able to afford it. Secondly, we'd have made relatively little money, and we'd have had a very different relationship. The relationship we have with every orchestra, because we're sharing and we're partners rather than selling, is completely different. We help them to train the orchestras, we help to train the teachers. So that is a program that has a huge impact. It already reaches over 300,000 kids around America. And as I said, it'll be 5 million over the next 10 years. And we're looking at a lot of our other programs in that sense. So next year's our 125th anniversary, and a lot of what we're trying to raise money for and to do is to leverage other programs so we can enhance the benefit in multiples. And partnership to me is key. Anybody, it's a bit like you as an individual. If you try and do everything yourself, you're very limited in what you can achieve. If you work with other people, but they have to be people who share your values, if you work with other people where you share values, the impact you can have is transformational. And that really lies behind the way we think about education.
Maybe with that, we'll start the clip, please.
Link Up is our program for 3rd through 5th graders, and it is all about introducing students to the orchestra by helping them get ready to become a part of it. They've been learning the melodies that they're going to play either on the recorder or that they're going to sing. If they happen to be fortunate enough to be in a string program, they might be learning some of those melodies on string instruments. And then they come to the concert, they're ready to play and sing. The performance is highly participatory. It's all about becoming a part of the Link Up ensemble.
It's just an amazing program with an amazing curriculum.
It's cool how you can choose if you want to sing or play the recorder. And if you play the recorder, you can hear what other instruments sound like with the recorder.
I thought the concert was great, really exciting, lively.
There are 3
I mean, what goes into the creative process in developing such an overarching program like this?
I mean, they're a huge amount of work, and I mean, one has to have people who are incredibly skilled. I mean, the challenge always is it's got to be educationally utterly meaningful and rigorous, and at the same time completely entertaining. So, I mean, our view always is you never call it education. People are going to have a good time. The minute you call it education, it sounds like hard work, and everybody switches off immediately. So our whole view is the kids are going to have a great time, and incidentally, they will have learned a huge amount. And that takes enormous skill to do that. And these programs are all alive. You can't just create something like this and then it runs for 10 years. Every year we're reviewing it and saying, how can it be better? What do we need to change? So every single thing is organic and keeps growing.
When you're developing your educational materials and programs, how do you distinguish amongst or think about different genres of music? I mean, is it primarily classical, or how do you fit in other styles?
It's a good question, because one of the interesting things I find so often is when you speak to people about music, lots of people they're intimidated by classical music. The minute you say the word, they think, well, I really don't know enough about that. I don't know how to dress. There's all sorts of worries about how you engage with classical music. And one of the things we do with all our music education is we don't put labels on anything. So in fact, when they're working on a project like this, and any of our projects, they don't know whether it's classical music, jazz, world music, pop music. So there may be a Beatles song, and the next thing may be Mozart, and they don't realize those are 2 different things. So we're engaging them with music. And so the answer is Carnegie Hall is about the best of every sort of music, but in our music education programs, we don't like to draw lines or create borders. It's just important that people should engage with and love music. And I think that's one of the reasons why for kids, they don't realize they're adoring Mozart. If you ask them if they like Mozart, they'd probably worry about whether they like Mozart. And this way, they don't realize they're loving it.
I see. You talked a little bit before about the values of Carnegie and how one determines and then develops programs that align with those values. Could you talk a little bit about your philosophy of value creation?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of values that drive what we do. I've spoken about some of them. Money follows vision. We never, ever will chase money. I think, it's one of the death traps, I think, for artistic organizations, and they do it often, which is if somebody offers you a lot of money and says, could you do this? You think you can't turn down the money. Well, we will turn it down if it's something we don't believe in absolutely. And I just feel that if I have that sort of conversation with a potential donor and they say, could you do this? It's my responsibility to try and find a way of getting them to marry their objectives with what we want to do and what we believe in. Now, occasionally you're going to reach the point you absolutely cannot do that. And then you've got to have the courage to say no. So money follows vision is a fundamental thing. I mean, never, never allow the money to lead who you are and what you are. The Rostropovich thing that I was talking about, everything matters, is really, really important. I think the whole thing about everybody should keep learning throughout their life, humility and wanting to learn and asking questions. I mean, our view is questions are more important than answers. And lots of people, you'll talk to them about a problem and they'll say, I think you should do this. To me, that's completely uninteresting because the fact is, how can you know the answer if you haven't explored what all the questions are? And so we try and have a culture within the organization where everybody will look at every question they can think of first before we start trying to find answers. So that, again, is a real fundamental. And so, I mean, there's a lot of things like that. That are the fundamental values. And to me, values are the most important single thing that define every human being and every institution. And that we all have to start from the values. And all the values have to be our own as well. It's not a question of taking them off a shelf and, and saying, this is a great set of values, I'm going to take it. And it's always a danger, I find, with religion, where people think you just simply are told what the values are. I think you have to find them yourself. It doesn't mean religion is wrong. And of course, so many of the values in religion are fundamental and they're really important. But everything we do is about people exploring their own way and becoming discoverers and becoming explorers for their whole life. That's what we're trying to engender in people.
Well, I guess the follow-up question would be then, how do you measure success from a Carnegie Hall's perspective?
Do you mean in performances, in education?
I guess with both.
I mean, it's one of the hardest things to do in the arts because you can't, there's not a measure, you can't measure it by revenue. I mean, if you're in a business, you might measure it by revenue or numbers of customers or whatever. In the end, we do a lot of evaluation in our education work. We do have assessments trying to see what the outcomes are. We don't believe in outputs, we believe in outcomes. So we're looking at what are the outcomes in terms of, the development of the person. And we work with a lot of schools on that basis as well. In terms of performance, in the end, it's very difficult because it comes down to, are people coming to your concerts? Are the reviews good? I mean, you've got to be very careful because the danger with all of these things is that what you can end up is being a follower instead of a leader. And we have to be a leader. We've got to be defining the territory and defining new ideas and exploring all the time and taking people on a journey of discovery all the time. If we just live in a comfortable zone, I mean, if we wanted to make the best amount of money, have the biggest audiences, we would just do Beethoven and Mozart and Brahms. We would just do those things all the time. It's easy. The fact is, it can never be comfortable, and you can never repeat yourself. I mean, that's the other challenge. We did this huge Japan festival. Afterwards, the Japanese ambassador came to me and said, when can we do this again? And I said, the trouble is we can't, because we've done it. We have to do something completely different next time. And so you never can repeat yourself. So it's an unbelievably demanding business to be in, the fact that you never can or should repeat yourself. So there's a lot of things like that. So, but my view is we have to be leaders, not followers. So what you don't do is audience research. What you don't do is say, what would you like to hear? Because audience research always tells you about yesterday. It never tells you about tomorrow. You've got to help define tomorrow. And I mean, I don't know if any of you have read the Steve Jobs biography, but in it, somebody once said to him about doing audience research or customer research. And he said, I'm not interested in customer research. I have to discover what they will want tomorrow. So I feel the role of an artistic organization is exactly the same. We've got to lead them on a journey of discovery. And one of the things, just one little anecdote, which is there was one of our big supporters who only likes classical music. And we did this big festival, and she came along and she decided she was going to try something new. So there was this very, very contemporary ensemble, completely way out ensemble from Berlin. And she came to the concert. And at the intermission, I saw her going out very quietly with her coat. And I went up to her and I just said, what did you think? And she said, look, Clive, do you know the saying, curiosity killed the cat? Well, this cat is dead. The point is she tried. And we find people start exploring, but it's, people who love music go to theatre and dance and film. So everybody benefits. And I mean, again, that's what good partnerships should be. Everybody should benefit. So, I mean, that's again, is something we do. But I've slightly strayed from the evaluation. I mean, the answer is you only really know in the end if people will travel the journeys with you, and if the press and everybody else, sometimes you'll get bad reviews. I mean, you can't be just chasing good reviews. You'll get bad reviews. But if in the end people think that what you're doing is compelling and interesting and important, then in a sense that defines it.
I feel like I could sit here all day just listening to the insights that you share, but I think I should open up to questions from the audience. But as we transition to that, we have one more clip, which is, I think, just a very fun clip that showcases Carnegie's insatiable appetite for finding creative contexts for bringing music outside the traditional venue. And for those of you not familiar with New York, this is in the middle of Manhattan, this clip. Like this? Keep going? Good job.
So we know how to be silly as well.
Okay, we have a few minutes for questions and answers. We'll call out people. I would ask you to please stand up when you get the mic. State your name and affiliation, please. Thank you. Okay, the floor is open for questions. Okay, in the back.
Thank you. Not everyone has had the benefit to be trained to play an instrument, and not everyone has had a home in which they were raised with classical music. Supposing someone late in life wants to begin the adventure, do you have any advice about how someone can, in a pretty effective way, start to love classical music?
Well, firstly, I don't think you need to play an instrument to love classical music. I mean, I think they are two. Is this? Yeah. I don't know whether you could hear that. I don't think you need to be able to play to be able to love classical music. I mean, one can be a consumer without being a player. But if you want to learn to play, I mean, I'd say it's firstly important to find out which is think about what is the instrument that matters to you. I mean, I found it, with myself, you always assume that people are musical, therefore it doesn't matter which instrument they pick up. It's a bit like saying a sportsman, can do any sport. Well, they can't. And it's true I learned piano when I was a kid from the age of 7. And I knew I didn't want to learn the piano. I didn't like the piano. I always wanted to learn the cello. I spent 3 years learning the piano. I was useless. And at the age of 10, in the end, my mother allowed me to take the cello. And suddenly, I had a talent, and it could work. So usually people know themselves what is the instrument they love, which is the voice they love. So it's very important to know that for a start. Secondly, it's to get a teacher who really knows how to teach somebody who is an adult beginner, because it's a very, very different way of teaching. And I mean, when I was a music student, I used to teach adults, and I really enjoyed it because, but they tend to want to be much more analytical. They want to know and understand a lot of the things about the physical side of how you do it, whereas kids are not remotely interested in that. So it's very, very different sorts of teaching. So it is to find the right sort of teacher, but it is, I promise, it's, don't think it will be easy. Because it is tough, and the trouble is it's a muscular thing as well, and the older one gets, the muscles just aren't as flexible in the same way. So you need to get advice on that too. I mean, at least you're young. But if it's somebody older, I mean, for instance, a string instrument can be incredibly difficult if you, where it may be much easier to play the piano.
Next, right here.
Thanks very much. Hi, my name's Ed Rogers. I'm in the financial services industry, so that money follows vision thing. It's very interesting to hear your comment. Love the presentation, love the work you do. I'm very curious about the vision part of it. How do you keep your vision fresh? How do you come up with the idea of conduct us, and we're going to go out in the middle of the street and wait for somebody to figure out that means you're supposed to stand up at the podium and start conducting? It's fascinating because you're in such a creative business to begin with, but how do you, again, just maintain that vision thing of finding what they want next before they've even figured out that that's what they want? And it's it's a very hard question to answer, but I'm very curious to know your answer to it.
No, it's a great question, Ed, and there's a number of aspects to it. I mean, where I always start, I mean, people have different views on this. Where I always start is I want to involve the musicians, the performers, who I think are the most exciting, greatest performers there are. And then I want to explore their vision. In the end, nobody in the audience is interested in hearing what the executive and artistic director of Carnegie Hall wants. If it's Valery Gergiev conducting or Leonard Bernstein, whoever it is, they want the music on that platform to be about Leonard Bernstein, about whoever the artist is. But then the interesting balancing act is you then have to have the conversation with whoever it is, Leonard Bernstein, whoever, and explore the things that they're interested in and find your way to come to something which they're still excited about, but you're excited about, and which actually works in terms of where your own future direction is going. What are the things you're trying to say that season, or where are you trying to develop your music over the coming years? So you've got to have your own strong vision about, firstly, the shorter term, which is how does an entire season look? Because otherwise, if you just went to every great musical performer and said, what would you like to do? They'd all do different things. The season would mean nothing as a totality. So you've got to come up with something which is not only about involving the most extraordinary performers, but then how do you shape the ideas so that it means something as a whole? And as well, where are you trying to go over the years? So, I mean, I'll just give you an example. With the festivals that I created when I started at Carnegie Hall, we've had explorations of Japan, of China, of Latin America, of African American music, of Berlin, of Vienna. So, I mean, it's not countries, it's not... there's nothing that guides that, and we just want to explore ideas that we think are fascinating. Now, we're thinking about how do we develop that concept even further, and each time with those concepts, it's, as I spoke before, it's cross-cultural. It's about every aspect of the arts and culture. But now we're thinking, how can we go even broader? And so we're, in 2 years' time, which you're not allowed to say, but in 2 years' time, I've spoken to Robert Caro. I don't know who, those of you who know him, he wrote the LBJ books. I mean, I think possibly the greatest historian of our time, and asked him what is a subject he'd like to explore. Now, he won't be the curator, but he will come up with ideas. And what he said, and I said, do you like the idea of doing this? And he said, love it. And I said, well, could you go away and think about it? And he said, no. I know what I want to do. It's the 60s. So what we're going to do is the 60s. Now, we'll talk to great institutions across the city, but it also means we can do civil rights, women's rights, or gay rights. I mean, all the sorts of things that were happening at that time. It means we've got an even broader canvas. So, in that sense, one is always challenging and testing oneself. However good an idea, you've got to say, how can it be better? And every single great artist, it comes back to the humility thing, which I think applies just as much to companies and to businesses and to individuals as it does to great performers. Tomorrow's got to be better than today. And I mean, again, to quote Rostropovich, I remember, every time you went into his room after a concert, lots of people go in and say, oh, maestro, you were incredible, wonderful, fantastic. He was never interested. All he was thinking about is, how can I be better tomorrow? And that's what we're trying to do with our programming as well. So never static. Keep exploring, and it's got to be things that excite you, personally. I mean, that's the other lesson I learned very early on, which was when I started, because I fell into management by mistake. I was never interested in management, and it was the last thing I ever thought I wanted to do. And my orchestra got into bad financial problems. They couldn't find a manager, so they thought they'd get somebody to go in for 3 months. So I ended up doing it for 21 years. But the fact is, in the very early days, when I knew nothing, there was a very important manager came to see me, and he said, look, I've got this incredible idea for a project. And he told me about it. And it didn't excite me. And I thought, he knows so much more than I do. He must be right. We did the project and it didn't succeed. So from that day onwards, it was a very good lesson to learn early on. If I'm not really excited and thrilled by an idea, don't do it. Never do something because you think it's right. It's got to feel right.
Okay, next. Right here.
My name is Masanori Takahashi. I'm actually an opera singer, and I would like to ask you about this. People could be satisfied with what's on YouTube instead of going to the recital or concert. And as a performer, I believe there's nothing like a live music, but people could be satisfied. And I don't think it's between the competition between artists or the musician and the social media. It's more about collaborating, and I don't know how to put in words, but what's your idea about like YouTube or social media?
Yeah, thank you, Takahashi-san. I mean, just to say firstly that I agree with you that there is nothing that compares with a live performance. I think the good thing about media dissemination and media access to performances is it even raises further the demands on live performance. I mean, if live performance is good rather than extraordinary, it can't live in today's world because people can get good in lots and lots of other ways. So it's got to be a great experience. My view broadly about media is, I mean, there are several dimensions to this. One is, if I think Carnegie Hall, 99% of the world's population will probably never be able to come to Carnegie Hall. You know, they won't come to New York. I mean, you know, they can't. I mean, from all around the world, I would guess 99% will never come to Carnegie Hall. So either we say it's only about the live experience, or we say, well, what are the other ways we can share what we do? It may not be the same as a live experience, and it may not have the same validity, but sharing it is still an important experience, and you can still give the essence or some of the essence of what matters. So number one is, I think the whole sharing side is really important because most people can't come and actually experience the music there. But on the other hand, if they get access to a Carnegie Hall performance and it makes them interested in something where they live, that's great as well. I mean, we're about the future of music, not the future of Carnegie Hall. We don't serve Carnegie Hall, we serve people. And so, you know, that's really important. Otherwise, in general terms, I mean, look, we use social media, we communicate through all of the channels there are. And obviously that gets more and more complex, and the demands from a marketing department are huge because they always think the marketing budget should keep going up because there's more and more platforms which one needs to communicate through. I mean, my view is if the revenue is not going up, you can't justify the expenditure going up on marketing. So therefore, the marketing department has to choose which platforms they use. So if they think printed material doesn't have the same impact, you spend less on that. You just readjust your budgets. But it's interesting. I mean, there are lots of ways one can do this imaginatively. I mean, this YouTube video that went viral, in fact, the conductor's one, it was just a fun idea. But vast numbers of people looked at that and probably got interested in music. We've just done a piece with Tan Dun that he composed, in which the audience could download the birdsong on their cell phone before the concert. And so the entire audience could participate in the performance because there were places in which the birdsong they'd downloaded could then be, was part of the performance. So there's lots of ways imaginative people as well can use social media, not just, in terms of talking about, engaging with music, but actually being participants as well. But there's also things where you have to draw lines. And we're very careful. I mean, for instance, we do not allow people to tweet from our concerts because our view is if you're busy doing this with your cell phone, you're disturbing other people's experience. In the end, the experience, everybody's got to be able to share that experience properly and in a meaningful way. So if audiences are doing things that don't allow other people to do that, then that is wrong. Now, some people would say that's very conservative. Our view is you have to look after everybody's experience. So there's a lot of difficult lines you have to draw.
Next, right here.
My name is Byron Siegel, and I work for Big Pharma. Baxalta. My background is the sciences, but a lot of what you said is a lot of similarity. And the first thing is, I'm so envious that you knew Rostropovich as well as you did. I had the privilege of seeing him in the 70s, and I'll still remember it like it was yesterday. And that every concert was the most important one. He got on stage, people were still shuffling. He sat there for what seemed like an eternity and walked off without playing a note. And then there was an announcement that said, he's not coming back until you're ready to listen. Yeah, and it was, and it was an unbelievable concert. I also, when you were talking about the trumpet player, I played trumpet through high school. I probably could have been that worst trumpet player.
You could have been it, right?
But my question is about the difference between science and art. We had the privilege at the ACC of listening to the Nobel winner, Professor Yamanaka. He won the Nobel Prize for inventing the iPS stem cells. And he had a mentor who taught him a lesson that what you needed to succeed was VW. And the W was hard work, but the V was vision. And you kept talking about vision and work. And that's exactly what he applied in his career as a scientist. And most people think science and arts are, opposite poles. And I'd just like to get your thought on that. Thank you.
Well, I mean, one of the things I find interesting is, in fact, I was going to be a mathematician. So I went to university to study mathematics and then realized I'd made a terrible mistake and music had to be my life. But the fact is, I was in the National Youth Orchestra of Great Britain as a kid, and half the people were not going to become musicians. They were just as good as the ones who were going to become musicians. Lots of them were mathematicians and scientists. And I think there's an incredible correlation, very powerful correlation, between the whole thing of discipline, rigor, and creativity in music and in science and math, which are absolutely shared. So, no, my view is that a lot of the things that are fundamental are absolutely shared between science and math, and science and music.
Okay, and just behind here.
Hi, my name is Kenta Koga. I run a small education nonprofit think tank. So one of the most inspiring takeaways...
And you're a conjurer.
Sorry?
And you're a conjurer.
So one of the most inspiring takeaways today was listening to you talk about your creative approach to running this very large institution. And the way you juggle and place, strategy, financial strategy and vision and how you craft your mission. And I was wondering if you have any plans of educating not just musicians, but next generation entrepreneurs and leaders, because I would love to learn as a young, person who's trying to run this nonprofit, your approach to running a company, running a big institution. Is that something that Carnegie Hall would ever plan to do, or?
It's a really interesting idea. The answer is we hadn't thought about it. I love the idea of looking at much more broadly based values around management, because after all the things one talks about, whether it's in science or whether it's in what we do, fundamentally, I think it's all about the similar things, but using a different channel. So, I genuinely like the idea. I'd love to think about that.
Well, I would love to participate if ever.
We have time for one more question, and the woman in back, right there.
Hi, my name is Efrat Weiss, and I'm a corporate trainer. You had said that you don't allow tweeting in your concerts, and there have been some articles recently about how audiences are on their phones during Broadway performances, and people are always distracted. So I'm just wondering how you as an organization handle that.
Well, in the end, the ushers are instructed, people are not allowed to take photographs, they're not allowed to be on their phones, they're not allowed to be tweeting or sending emails or texts or whatever it is. So we do have people go down and actually ask them to stop. Which I know is a distraction as well. But the fact is people have to know that it's not acceptable. So people hardly do it now, because once you've created the norm, then it's something you very rarely have to enforce. But the fact is we had to. I was at a concert the other day in Beijing, and it was interesting. The way that was done I found very uncomfortable, because they had people, the minute they saw somebody with their phone, using their phone in any form, they walked down with this huge lit up sign to tell them they weren't allowed to do it. So, I mean, it was a colossal interference, far more than the phone. So, I think there's different ways of doing it, but that wasn't it.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and everyone, let's please a round of applause for Clive. So I'm called upon to give closing remarks here, and frankly, I'm going to have to start with, wow. Thank you, Clive. I think we all came here expecting to hear about Carnegie Hall, music, et cetera, and we learned not only life lessons, but also a lot about the whole idea of Carnegie Hall giving back, giving away, sharing, and education. And it was profound. It was a profound learning experience for me, and I think for everyone here today. I hope so. And as Rostopovic said, today was absolutely the best thing I could have done between 12 and 2 o'clock today. And I hope everyone agrees. And so can we give a big round of applause?